Jack kicked a pebble down the street as he and his sister Emily walked home from school, the late October air biting at their noses. The leaves, now brown and shriveled, crunched beneath their feet. He could feel Halloween creeping closer with each passing day. Jack loved Halloween, but this year, his mind was on something more mysterious. The old graveyard at the edge of town. "You're not still thinking about going to the cemetery, are you?" Emily asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "Maybe," Jack muttered, still focused on the pebble. He wasn't about to let her stop him. He was 12 now, practically a teenager. He wasn't afraid of some dumb ghost stories. "Don't even think about it," she warned. "That place is creepy enough during the day. On Halloween, you've lost it." Jack shrugged. "I just want to check it out. People say weird stuff happens there on Halloween." "People say a lot of things," Emily shot back. "Doesn't mean it's true." As they passed by the weathered old house of Old Man Graves, Jack's thoughts wandered. Graves had lived in the town forever, and though most people didn't pay him any mind, Jack had heard whispers that he knew more about the town's dark history than anyone else. Right on cue, the old man was sitting on his front porch, wrapped in a faded blanket despite the cold. His eyes, sharp as ever, caught sight of Jack and Emily. "Heading to the graveyard, eh, boy?" Graves's raspy voice carried across the street. "Best be careful. Not everything stays buried, especially not on Halloween." Emily rolled her eyes, but Jack's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" he asked, stopping mid-step. Graves's gaze darkened. "There's a lantern buried deep in that graveyard, boy. Belonged to the first gravedigger. Some say it's cursed. You light it, you'll see things you weren't meant to see." Emily grabbed Jack's arm and tugged him forward. "Don't listen to him, Jack. He's just trying to scare you." Graves chuckled softly, his voice barely a whisper now. "Better hope you don't find it." Halloween night arrived, cold and clear, with just the faintest touch of mist clinging to the edges of the town. Jack had spent the entire evening trick-or-treating with his friends and Emily, but his mind never strayed far from Old Man Graves's warning. As soon as they got home, Jack pretended to go to bed but quickly changed into his warmer clothes. By the time the clock struck midnight, Jack was already sneaking out the back door, flashlight in hand. He made his way to the cemetery, the distant howls of the wind keeping him company. The gate loomed in front of him, rusted and crooked. Jack squeezed through the narrow opening, his heart pounding in his chest. The graveyard was vast and overgrown, with tall, gnarled trees casting twisted shadows over the gravestones. Jack moved cautiously, his breath coming out in small puffs of fog. Despite the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, the place felt unnervingly alive. He wandered between the graves, peering at the faded inscriptions, hoping to stumble upon something out of the ordinary. After what felt like an eternity, Jack's foot hit something hard. He looked down and saw the edge of something metallic, half buried in the dirt. He knelt, brushing away the dirt with his hands until the object was fully revealed. It was a lantern, old and rusted, but still intact. Strange symbols were etched into its sides, symbols Jack didn't recognize. With a shaky breath, Jack fumbled for a match from his pocket. He'd brought them just in case. His hands trembled as he struck the match and touched the flame to the lantern's wick. The flame caught immediately, burning a ghostly blue. As soon as the lantern's light flickered to life, the air around Jack seemed to freeze. The wind died, and an eerie stillness settled over the graveyard. Jack's flashlight flickered and died in his hand. "Great," Jack muttered, shaking the useless flashlight. But the strange blue flame from the lantern was bright enough to guide him. He held it up and began to walk deeper into the cemetery. But something felt off. The shadows cast by the lantern's glow were strange, elongated, distorted. They twisted and moved as if they had minds of their own. Jack's pulse quickened as he realized the shadows weren't just of trees and gravestones. He saw figures, pale, translucent figures, moving between the graves. People. No, not people. Ghosts. Jack's breath hitched as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide in disbelief. The figures didn't seem to notice him. They moved as if stuck in time, replaying the moments before their deaths. One ghost, an old woman, clutched at her chest and collapsed to the ground in front of her grave. Another, a soldier, limped forward with a look of pain etched on his face before falling to his knees. Jack's heart raced. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The lantern's light burned steady, illuminating the spectral parade before him. That's when he noticed the figure standing at the edge of the light, a shadow darker than the night itself. The figure didn't move. It stood just beyond the lantern's reach, its shape tall and cloaked in darkness, watching. Jack's throat tightened as fear gripped him. He took a step back, and the shadow figure mirrored his movement, always staying just beyond the light's edge. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the graveyard. Jack whipped around to see the cemetery gates slowly swinging shut, creaking as they locked with a final, ominous thud. His breath came in ragged gasps now. He turned back to where the shadowy figure had stood, but it was gone. The wind picked up, cold and biting, and Jack knew he was trapped. Meanwhile, Emily had checked Jack's room earlier and found his bed empty. She knew exactly where he'd gone. Grabbing her coat and a flashlight, she rushed out the door, heading straight for the graveyard. As she arrived, Emily noticed the cemetery gates were closed, though they never had been locked before. Her stomach churned with unease as she pushed through the narrow opening and stepped inside. "Jack?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet night. No answer. Emily's flashlight beam darted over the gravestones as she moved deeper into the cemetery. She didn't believe in ghosts, but something about this place always unsettled her, especially tonight. "Jack, where are you?" Suddenly, she saw a faint blue light flickering in the distance. She quickened her pace, following the light, hoping it was her brother. Jack was crouched behind a crumbling mausoleum, the lantern's light barely keeping the dark at bay. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but every time he glanced toward the shadows, the figure was still there, lurking. The wind howled, carrying with it faint whispers, words Jack couldn't make out, but the tone was clear. Leave. He wanted to. He wanted to run, but the gate was shut, and the shadow was blocking his only way out. That's when he heard Emily's voice. "Jack!" His heart leapt in his chest as he peeked out from behind the mausoleum. There she was, his sister, standing in the distance with her flashlight pointed in his direction. Relief flooded him. "Emily!" he shouted, waving her over. She sprinted toward him, but as she got closer, her flashlight flickered and died. The lantern's blue flame cast long, eerie shadows over her face, and she slowed to a stop when she saw the look of terror in Jack's eyes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jack didn't know how to explain it. There's something here, something following me." Emily's eyes darted around the graveyard. "Come on, let's go home." "We can't," Jack said. "The gate is locked and there's something in the shadows." Emily swallowed hard, her usual confidence faltering. "Okay, then we'll find another way." Before they could make a move, a soft, raspy voice echoed through the graveyard. "You've gone and done it now, boy." Both Jack and Emily turned to see Old Man Graves emerging from the mist, his thin figure almost blending with the fog. "How did you?" Emily began, but Graves silenced her with a raised hand. "The lantern," Graves said, nodding toward it. "You found it." Jack held the lantern tighter. "What is this thing?" Graves's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "That lantern belonged to the first gravedigger of this town. He made a deal with something dark, something that should have stayed buried." "What deal?" Emily asked. Graves stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "The lantern shows the dead, but it also calls them. It calls something far worse." Jack's heart pounded. "How do we stop it?" Graves sighed, the weight of years in his gaze. "The lantern must be returned to where it belongs, on the grave of the first gravedigger. That's the only way to break the curse." Emily grabbed Jack's arm. "Let's do it." But as they turned to leave, the shadowy figure appeared again, this time closer, its dark presence looming over them. The wind howled louder, and the whispers in the air grew more frantic. Jack's grip on the lantern tightened as the figure advanced. "Go," Graves urged. "You haven't much time." Jack and Emily sprinted through the graveyard, weaving between tombstones and dodging gnarled branches. The shadowy figure followed, always just a step behind. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they reached the gravedigger's tomb, a large, weathered stone with the name Thorn carved into it. "Put the lantern on the grave," Emily shouted. Jack rushed forward, his hands shaking as he placed the lantern on top of the tombstone. The blue flame flickered, casting strange shadows over the grave, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a blinding flash, the lantern's light flared, and the shadowy figure let out a low, guttural growl before vanishing into the night. The wind died down, and the graveyard fell silent. Jack and Emily stood there, breathless as the blue flame slowly faded from the lantern. The heavy feeling that had hung in the air all night seemed to lift, leaving only an eerie stillness behind. Graves approached them, his footsteps slow and measured. "You did it," he said quietly. "Is it over?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. Graves nodded. For now. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Jack and Emily walked back home, the cemetery gates creaking open as they passed through. The events of the night weighed heavily on their minds, but the sense of relief was undeniable. Neither of them spoke until they reached their house. Emily turned to Jack, her face pale but calm. "Let's never do that again." Jack managed a weak smile. "Agreed." That night, Jack lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that maybe the curse wasn't fully broken. He tried to push the thought away, convincing himself it was over. Just as Jack began to drift off, he heard a soft, metallic click from somewhere in the room. His eyes snapped open. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Jack sat up in bed, straining to hear through the quiet. A few seconds passed in silence before the hallway light flickered. The warm glow dimmed once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging his room into darkness. Jack's pulse quickened. He glanced toward his door, but the only thing visible was the faint outline of the window. Then something else caught his eye. A flicker of light, barely noticeable at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. His heart raced as he turned slowly toward the source of the light. Sitting on the windowsill, as if it had been there all along, was the lantern. The same rusted, ancient lantern he had left behind on the gravedigger's tomb. Its blue flame burned softly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jack's mouth went dry. He blinked, hoping it was a trick of his imagination, but the lantern remained, its light unwavering. He didn't dare move, his eyes locked on the flickering flame. For a long moment, he sat frozen in his bed, staring at the lantern as it seemed to pulse with quiet, otherworldly energy. The faint whispers he had heard in the graveyard drifted back into his mind, growing louder, as if the flame itself was trying to speak to him. Jack swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he reached out, unsure whether to grab the lantern or run. Before he could decide, a soft breeze wafted through the open window, and the lantern's light flickered once more, then extinguished with a quiet pop. Darkness returned, the room silent once again. Jack stared at the empty windowsill, his heart pounding in his chest. The lantern was gone, as if it had never been there. But Jack knew better. The curse wasn't broken, not completely, and somewhere out there, the lantern still waited for him.